Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Mike Shelby.
Hello and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Out Front. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. By the way, there's a question here about if I served in OIF and OEF. Yes, I was in Afghanistan from 06-07, Iraq 08-09, and then back in Afghanistan 10 and 11. And if you were in Afghanistan 06-07, we were there at probably the exact same time. It's a big 10th Mountain Division rotation. All right. On today's show, we're talking about Threat Analysis 101. I'm going to cover some basics for you, enough to get you started on your area study, the threat analysis portion. I just ask that you take this instruction and do something with it. Go do a threat analysis for your area. Be serious about it. Be realistic. Be inquisitive. Start from the concept that you know absolutely nothing about the area. If you assume some knowledge, go ahead and annotate that somewhere and just say, I think this is true. I don't know for a fact. Go ahead and try to confirm or deny that. Now, on yesterday's show, I talked about how to do a quick down and dirty area study and assessment. If you haven't watched that one, you should start there. It's right here on this channel, or it's on the podcast because this is on all major platforms. It is for now. I guess we'll see what happens when we get to the end of today's show if we're still up on those podcast platforms. By the way, I am over on Odyssey somewhere. I'll get the link for everyone. That way, if I do get PNG'd off of YouTube or wherever else, I'll be sure to tell you where I live online. Now, today's shout out of the day goes to the newest Patreon supporters, Alex, Chris, Randall, and Tony. Meanwhile, Tim B. and Matthew M. coming in strong with their $10 a month support. It's much appreciated, gentlemen. Thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you every day. By the way, over on Patreon, go ahead and hit me with your questions on intelligence, security, and how to win, or at least not lose. I'd be happy to give you first crack at the day's questions. And I'm checking messages over there every single day. So if you reach out, there's a 100% chance that I'm going to see it. All right. Now, has anyone ever watched Dave Ramsey? Or maybe do you still watch or listen to Dave Ramsey? People call into a show. I've been listening to Dave Ramsey probably since I was in high school. Off and on. And people call into his show and they explain their financial problems. Some have some really bad problems. And Dave Ramsey talks them through those problems. And I want to be the Dave Ramsey of SHTF intelligence or strategic preparedness. So hit me with those questions. Keep in mind, operation security, personal security. But let me know about if you want, about a local situation, be as general as you want to be or as specific as you want to be, I guess. And keep in mind security. And let's see if we can work our way through those problems, because I imagine a lot of you out there have very similar problems. Over on Twitter, I noted that for the past 2 weeks, Haitian gangs have been in a new turf war. They have murdered, raped, and burned people alive. 148 people have been murdered so far in this war between these two gangs. Some people have been hacked to death with machetes. Other people burned to death or maybe even died of smoke inhalation as their homes were being burned down around them. A special note to all you aspiring warlords out there: there's a steep learning curve. This exam is pass or fail, and results are final. I think a great many Americans don't really understand the reality of the things that I sometimes talk about on this show. I think Americans tend to, especially online, tend to overestimate their capacity, their personal and group capacity for violence. And I want you to know that when I talk about these things like revolutionary warfare or insurgency, I don't do it lightly. This is not a fantasy land. This is not a prepper fiction novel. We're talking about people losing their lives here permanently, often in very heinous ways. And that's the reality of low intensity conflict. That's especially the reality of tribal warfare. Last year, Haiti's prime minister was assassinated, and that country has been in the depths of pretty brutal tribal warfare for probably since 1791. And by the way, Ben, hit me with that Hit me with that image there from, there we go. Yeah, so Michel de Montaigne, Mikey Mike, said back in the 1550s or somewhere, he said, quote, in truth, a foreign war is nothing so dangerous a disease as a civil. And that's a good reminder. Civil wars are often much more brutal than foreign invasions. And this is why you absolutely must be doing your area study. And I see a couple of folks in there talking about that they've started their area study recently. I'm really glad to hear that. Everything hinges on the area study. You learn so much about your area in an area study. You've got to do it. You got to start. I want to cover some history briefly. All right, Ben, we're good. I want to cover some history briefly, and then we'll get into threat analysis 101. Historians point to this period, and I'm going to bring this full circle. Historians point to the period of 1770 to 1870 as being the most revolutionary period of human history. Revolutions occurred around the world, starting in 1773 was the Pugachev revolt in Russia. Of course, the American Revolution started in earnest in 1776, but probably had roots back in the 1760s. The French Revolution, not too far behind, in 1789. In 1820, the Greeks revolted against the Ottomans. 10 years later, in 1830, there was the Balkan Revolt against the Ottomans. 1848, the Egyptian Revolt against the Ottomans. This is the big one. Okay, everyone says, all right, 1861 to 65, American Civil War, AMREV 2, whatever you want to call it. Okay. There was a war 10 years before that in which 20 million people were killed. And that was the Taiping Revolution in China. That was China's, the bloodiest revolt in Chinese history. 20 million people killed during the Taiping Rebellion. And in his book, Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World, Jack Goldstone points out that in the 100 years preceding 1770, which is roughly 1660 to 1760, he writes, quote, full-scale political breakdown was curiously rare. And it's almost as if these revolutions just popped up out of nowhere, and they were global as well. And of course, war was ever present during that period of time. But he said that although war was present, what historians see during that period was not state breakdown and revolution. All of a sudden, boom, 1770, you have this massive spike in state breakdown and revolution. And I wonder if we are not, because we just reported, maybe you saw it in sometime earlier this week, the prime minister of Sri Lanka was deposed due to high prices, inflation, food shortages. Earlier this year, we reported warning from the IMF that said something like, 40, I think it's about roughly 40% of the countries on earth are emerging markets or developing economy. Or no, that can't be right. Maybe 40% are emerging markets. And emerging markets right now are at the highest risk of default. And so Sri Lanka is probably the first domino to fall. And we haven't really even gotten into global food shortages yet. There are going to be a lot of countries, probably a lot of countries that have political stability, maybe state breakdown and revolution. And I wonder if, given what's happening, not just in these emerging markets, these third world countries, but what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the United States, what's happening in a lot of other countries. I wonder if we're not maybe coming up on another period, maybe 100-year period of state breakdown and revolution. Because, just to recap what I talked about, I don't know, earlier this week or last week, whenever it was, Goldstone has these four indicators or four prerequisites for inflation. For revolution. The first is population growth. The second is inflation and a fiscal crisis. The third is intra-elite divisions over social mobility. Basically, these people in these countries or in these kingdoms fighting each other for elite status. And number four, mobilization of citizens with religious-like zealotry for political change. Sure seems like all of these things we are seeing right now here in the United States, which is another reason to do your area study. All right, let's talk about some threat analysis here. There are four types of threats. All right. And what we want to do is we want to go through each 4 of these types of threats and consider what what threats that fall under each category exist now, known threats, or suspected threats. Like, I don't know. Let's just say I do know, but let's just say I don't. Uh, I know that cartels are active in Central Texas. I don't know that MS-13 is in my county. They happen to be, but they're suspected threats, MS-13 or whatever cartels you might have or gangs or whatever you have in your area. So suspected threats, and then potential threats. Maybe there's not MS-13 in your county or in your area, but they could become a problem in the future. Let's just say. So known, suspected, and potential threats. That's what we need to do for each of these 3 categories. You can sit down and do this by yourself, but no one is as smart as everyone. Intelligence is a team sport. This really should be a group process. So what I recommend is sitting down with your preparedness network or whatever you have, your family, your group of buddies, crack a beer. Let's start talking about threats and go through this list and brainstorm and at least try to get that 80% solution here. So the first threat type is conventional. These are things like standing armies or invading armies, occupying armies, or tyrannical forces or something like that. Like martial law, for instance, would be an example of conventional threat. Next, we have things like irregular threats. Gangs, mobs, looters, insurgents, revolutionaries, rioters, whatever. Let's talk about the difference between conventional threats and irregular threats. Conventional threats typically have de jure authority. They have some form of legal authority. They're a member of the government, they're a member of law enforcement, they're a member of the military. Typically, not always, but typically they are uniformed and they have some kind of scepter of authority, like a badge or a patch or something like that. Not always, but often. Those are conventional threats. So, for instance, Russia's invasion of Ukraine largely is a conventional threat to Ukrainians. Irregular threats, on the other hand, typically wield de facto authority. They derive their power from de facto authority. De facto authority means that they're there with a gun and they're in charge, right? It's like Captain Phillips, where the little skinny dude says, "Look at me, I'm the captain now." That's de facto authority. He has no legal authority, no legal right to take over that ship, but he's doing it anyway. De facto authority. Typically, irregular threats do not wear uniforms. Typically, they do not have scepters of authority. Sometimes insurgent groups will have like a patch or a flag, not always, or any kind of revolutionary groups or rebels or guerrillas or what have you. You know, typically they have a name, but maybe that's about it. Typically, do not wear a uniform. So those are the differences between conventional and irregular threats. And what you need to do is, again, look at conditions now, and you say, right now, Thursday, 12 May 2022. Here are the threats that are in my area right now. Write those down. And then say, move on to suspected. And you say, well, I don't know for a fact that they're here, but I think they could be here. Go ahead and write it down and try to confirm or deny that assumption or key assumption through, I don't know, intelligence gathering. And then move on to potential. Put yourself in that situation. Say, what catastrophic event am I concerned about? Maybe it's a hurricane. Maybe it's an EMP or some grid down scenario or whatever. Maybe it's a major cyber attack that knocks out the internet or whatever you're concerned about. And say, okay, what threats, which of these threats could I potentially encounter? And then write those down. And now all of a sudden, we are building a picture of what our security situation is going to look like. And one of the things I talked about yesterday is if you have assets in your area that you can turn into strategic advantages, then I would be more inclined to stay. If you have threats or vulnerabilities or limitations in your area that might become strategic disadvantages for you that you cannot overcome, you can't mitigate those risks, then I would be more inclined to leave. So those threats are on here. If there are threats that turn into strategic disadvantages, then I would be more likely to leave the area. Maybe try to go to somewhere that I think is going to be safer. And again, listen, my job is not to talk people in or out of what you should be preparing for. You know your area way better than I ever could. And ultimately, it's up for you to decide. Put on your thinking cap, be realistic, and be sober. And the more we understand about history and the more we know about an area, the better conclusions probably we're going to be able to arrive at. And once we arrive at those conclusions, we think through the logical consequences, the follow-on effects, the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth order effects of these events. And now we're doing the work of intelligence analysis. We are reducing uncertainty about the future by looking at the facts and evidence and drawing conclusions. And the better analyst you are, the more accurate your conclusions are going to be. Also, I would just add briefly, everyone, I don't know, you get caught up in logic. Oh, is this a logical conclusion or is this a rational conclusion? Well, some people are not logical. Some people are not rational. Some people are irrational. And people call this the rational or irrational actor theory. So a big problem especially for Americans, a big problem in intelligence analysis is looking at things through an American lens. If you're a white kid growing up in the suburbs, you are probably not going to understand at an expert level. You're not going to have a great understanding of inner city gang culture or of Hispanic culture. If you didn't grow up in that, you've never exposed to that. You can be the best Russian military analyst on earth. And when you get put in the West African division and you're an analysis for West African tribes and warlords, you're going to be making coffee for people who know that area much better than you. So a lot of this is subject matter expertise. And if you live in an area where there are cultures or people that you are not familiar with, I highly encourage you, get to know these people or get to understand their culture and learn what's more realistic and less realistic about how these people may act in the future. And the better we understand that, the better we're going to be able to judge what's more likely or less likely to happen in the future. And at the point that you can judge what's more accurately judge what's more likely or less likely in the future, now all of a sudden we can prioritize our limited resources to dealing with those most likely events or dealing with the more likely events and conditions. All right, the first two of the four threats are conventional and irregular. After that, we have catastrophic threats. And catastrophic threats are mass casualty causing events. So a hurricane, a nuclear plant meltdown, a pandemic, natural or man-made pandemic, is a catastrophic threat. If you have catastrophic threats for your area, go ahead and write those down. Things that, for instance, tornadoes around here, 100%. A tornado is going to touch down somewhere in this area. It's 100% going to happen every year. I'm going to put that into my catastrophic threat list because that is going to happen. And then finally, there are disruptive threats. And disruptive threats may be things like an ice storm or a flood or a power outage that lasts for 10 hours or maybe 10 days. And you should differentiate between, a 10-day power outage and a 10-week power outage, or a one-day power outage or a 1-year power outage. Because one of those things is going to be disruptive. The other thing is probably going to be catastrophic, or earthquakes or whatever you have in your area. All right, so those are the four types of threats: conventional, irregular, catastrophic, and disruptive. Think your way through these problems. Write down known, suspected, or potential threats. Do a little due diligence. Ask around. Go on a ride along with local law enforcement. if they offer those things. If they offer a Citizens Police Academy, go take the Citizens Police Academy. That will give you what's called access. You can then ask questions in a as a concerned citizen. I'm concerned about gangs in the area, and I don't know anything about the gangs. Uh, what what gang color should I be looking for instance, right? That's a pretty innocuous question. I wouldn't like start prying, but the more you build familiarity with these people who do know, uh, maybe the more time you spend with them, or I don't know, if you go volunteer at some of these law enforcement agencies, you might befriend some of these people, and they may be very willing to tell you about area gangs or about area threats. And the more we can leverage that to expand our situational awareness of an area, the better we will be. And again, you want to move from situational awareness, which is I know a problem exists, to situational understanding. I know a problem exists, and this is what I can expect in the future. A lot of people stress situational awareness, and that's really great. I'm stressing situational understanding. It's not enough to know that X exists. We need to be able to anticipate Y and Z in the future because we know X exists. That's what intelligence can do. No amount of beans, bullets, and band-aids can reduce your uncertainty about the future. And it's not frustration. I don't know what it is. But sometimes I see people talking about, oh, better stock up on MREs and lensatic compasses and fire starters. And I just want to look that individual in the eyes and say, what gangs are in your area? And how can you recognize them? What colors do they use? Or what gang signs do they use? Or what does their graffiti look like? And if you can't tell me that, I don't give two stuffs about your lensatic compass, brother. My brother in Christ, I do not care about your fire starters. I want to know your understanding of area threats. Way more valuable than a fire starter. All right. With that, we'll get into some questions here. That's just a quick down and dirty look at basic threat analysis 101. 4 types of threats. All right. In a catastrophic US dollar crash, could we see impromptu borders form around blue cities and states and red areas? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, I guess by catastrophic US dollar crash, we're talking about hyperinflation. I don't know. Here's what concerns me about hyperinflation, especially with the red blue paradigm we have with cities and rural areas. Let me see. I don't know where this book is. It used to be right by me. There's a book about hyperinflation in Weimar, Germany. I think it's called The Death of Money. And in that book, I read it last year, and from time to time I flip through the pages, and I was just rereading a section of that book yesterday. One of the problems that they had in Weimar, Germany is that farmers were unwilling to sell food to the cities, because by the time the farmers shipped the food, transported the food to the cities, by the time the farmer was paid, those German marks were worth much less than what the original sale price was. Or by the time the money got back to the farmer and the farmer could spend it, the money was worth much less than when he was paid. And what you had happen was farmers stopped selling food, stopped transporting food into cities. Now, let's think through second and third order effects here. All of a sudden, food dries up. It is no longer coming into the cities. And I'm not even drawing conclusions here about the United States. I'm talking about history here, what's written in this book. There were riots. People from the cities went through these rural areas and they rioted and they killed farmers, and they literally killed cows and killed chickens and cooked them on the farm just to get something to eat. People from the city, the bugmen came and they killed the farmers and they took their livestock and killed their chickens and ate their eggs and did whatever else. In terms of hyperinflation, I think about that, about the dynamics of people living in the suburbs in rural areas in a city of 2 million or 5 million or 10 million or more people. I think that I think that's probably more than borders. I think that's probably my number one concern, what those bug men are going to do. Next question. How do you identify gangs or groups operating in your area without law enforcement input? Well, one thing you can do is task your friends as they're driving around to look for gang tags and take a picture of it and write down the location. This is on 13th Street and Bakalakadaka Avenue or whatever. And you can import those photos into Google Earth and you can make a neat little map. And at the point that you can identify what a particular gang tag is, then you can follow those gang tags and put them on a map and maybe get a rough boundary of where that gang operates. That's one way you could do it. Without law enforcement input, I'm going to assume that means without actually speaking with law enforcement. A lot of states have gang task forces. There are a lot of resources online as well about various gangs and what their tags look like. I would practice a little Google foo and start looking up that information. And that's kind of my initial answer off the top of my head. When doing a threat assessment, how far out should we be considering? 1 mile radius, 50 miles, half a tank of gas in distance. Well, start small. Really what you want to do is just say, okay, in a catastrophic SHTF situation, where do I need to go? Where am I traveling? If you're bugging in your home or maybe just linking up with friends around your neighborhood or in your subdivision or wherever you live, that would be called your area of operations or your AO. And I would look at the boundary of where I expect to operate, and you make that a shape, a circle, a square, a funky polygon, however big the area is or whatever shape it is. And you say, okay, I want to achieve information dominance within this boundary because this is where I will be 24/7 at any given moment, night or day. I will be in this geographic area. And that's how far I would start. Now, beyond that, beyond your area of operations, you have what's called the area of interest or your AI. And this is not where I'm going to expect to be, but I am interested in what happens here. So there are a couple of situations that arise here. You live 2 miles from a police station, or you live a half a mile away from the grocery store, or you live 5 miles from a prison or a nuclear power plant or whatever. I ain't going out there, but I'm still interested in what's happening over there. And so this would be my area of interest. So once you get your AO nailed down, you nail down your AI, you look at what's around your area of operations, areas in which you're interested, and then you identify key terrain or significant characteristics in this area, and then you draw your AI, and then you expand to your AI. Now, the other problem that people have is they live out in BFE, wherever. They live out in the middle of nowhere. And they say, I can't see my neighbors. My AO is 2,000 acres. And, or it's, the nearest population center is 20 miles away. Okay. Yeah, that's a little tougher. I would make those nearest population centers my area of interest. Wherever people might be coming from to my home would be, or my ranch or property or whatever, my farm. That would be my area of interest. And I hope that helps. When you've seen PMs trade as money, how did it go down? I've never seen precious metals traded as money. Nope, I never have. And I consider myself blessed to have never seen that. So unfortunately, I don't have anything for you. Although, just on this topic, I would add here. I hear a lot of people talk about bartering. Oh, you got to prepare to barter. You got to have lead and metals to barter. You got to have things that are worth stuff so that you can go barter. One of the great benefits we have in this country is transportation is fairly secure. We get stuff from a warehouse to a retail outlet, such as a grocery store, and no one is concerned about being robbed of all their stuff. At the point that security breaks down, because let's be honest, at the point you got to barter, we're talking about a breakdown in security. We're talking about a fundamental breakdown in the economy. Bartering is important. Being able to provide security is also very important. It is what you might call mission critical. I actually favor the idea of linking up with my local farmers market or starting a farmers market if your area does not have one, and being able to secure that in a worst case scenario. I mean, a grid down or a legit wheels come off this thing and stuff just gets real bad. Being able to secure a farmer's market, secure an area around a farmer's market, or secure transportation of goods to the farmer's market becomes just as important as what you have to barter. So I guess that's kind of my additional consideration on that. All right, we'll do a last question here. We'll do two last questions. Would you recommend a ride along with the local sheriff? Yes. And there's two questions about software or map services. Are there any map services more privacy oriented that would be a good alternative to Google Earth? Yeah, if you have your own ATAC server or CivTac server, you get some of the benefits of Google Earth. One other thing you may be able to do is, I don't know for a fact, if you can build a KMZ or KML on Google Earth, turn it into a shapefile, then you might be able to run. Well, if you can turn it into a shapefile, you can run ArcGIS maybe on your own server that may have some added privacy benefits, i.e. if it's not connected to the internet. Any software you prefer for making your maps? Yeah, man, I honestly just use Google Earth. For if you're doing anything, I hate to use the term sensitive, but I don't put anything online that I don't just assume is going to get scarfed up by someone else. So, maybe you can do some basic stuff on Google Earth. And actually, I'll just go ahead and tell you a little secret. I'm not going to tell you how to do it, but I'll tell you that you can do it. You can run Google Earth offline. And I'll just leave it at that. By the way, Peter's been he's been around here for a long time. And yesterday he asked me to sell him on the area intelligence course. And I didn't really feel like it. But I thought about it and I said, you know what? Here's a reason why everyone should take the area intelligence course. A couple of reasons. Number one, you need an area study. And you can do it on your own. You can do it to the best of your ability. If you've done any kind of operational planning, or maybe you're an intel guy in another life, maybe you're equipped with the skills and knowledge to do that. Very few people are. In my time in Iraq and Afghanistan, I got good at really two things: intelligence preparation of the battlefield / area studies, and targeting. Building targeting packages on absolute turds. If you want a fast track version to building an area study, if you want to understand how to do an area study at an expert level, looking at all six, by the way, if you ever see people talking about these 6 layers, they got it from me, because those 6 layers, they don't exist in some field manual somewhere. Stuff like that exists in like the IPB manual and some other stuff. But those are the 6 layers that I want to look at physically in order to assess an area, to do my area study. So if you want an expert coaching you on an area study step by step, making sure that you're not missing anything important, making sure that I'm providing things not just from experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, but also experience from building custom area studies for clients, building my own area studies here locally. If you want that kind of fast track to an area study, then it's in the area intelligence course. That's why you should go sign up. It's at www.grayzoneactivity.com. You click on store. It's the area intelligence course. And it will probably be the best online course you've ever taken. And by the way, I've seen a couple of folks in here saying that they have greatly benefited from the area intelligence course. So thanks to everyone who's saying that. All right. with that, that's going to be the last question for today. Matthew says reports that Finland has joined NATO. Yep. Mid-May. That's what they were saying. All right. Oh yeah. By the way, I just saw this thing over here. Just let me pull up my feed over here. I got a NATO feed. It's super cool. It's super cool as in I'm just seeing tons of stuff that's being reported about that. I don't know. Russia said they considered that an escalation, and NATO forces deployment in Finland and Sweden may make them Russian targets, diplomat warrants. Major escalation. Cape Town, VA, and another news update real quick. Biden is a potato. All right, guys, I'm going to be back on the show tomorrow at 2 p.m. Central Time. Certainly appreciate the support. I'll post these notes over at Patreon. That's patreon.com/outfront. Thank you very much for the support. Until next time, be well and stay out front.